Has anyone heard of qualified immunity before?
Yeah, we talk about it in civil liabilities.
Okay, so Garrett's heard about it. Abby, you heard about it in civil liability. Okay, Garrett heard about it in administration of justice. What about the rest of you? Is it familiar? Have you heard it in public discourse?
Yeah, I've heard it.
Okay.
Yeah, a little bit.
Abby, what is qualified immunity in civil liability terms?
In a civil way, it basically talks about how whether a police officer or corrections officer applies for immunity in like a use of force case, for example, since that's what we're talking about, whether they're immune to being sued or not in the most basic terms.
Yeah, I mean, basically it is because the officer, typically it's a police officer, a corrections officer, but it can also be like pretrial services or anyone involved in any government operation. Because they are acting as an agent of the government, meaning a representative of the government, effectively, legally speaking, the government, rather than that specific individual, you cannot sue that individual for any acts that they committed. You have to sue the government because the government did it.
It's called like responding a superior, isn't it? With the master answer.
That's an excellent question, and you know more about that area than I do because I've never heard that Latin before.
I think that's what it is. It's been a few years since I've seen it, so I may have pronounced it wrong.
I mean, it's something that I'm actively reading up on, but basically what it boils down to is it is very, very difficult to sue specific officers for behavior, okay? Because the gist of qualified immunity is until an officer does something so bad that it is actively and explicitly against the law, you can't sue them specifically for their behavior. Okay?
Isn't some legislation being proposed right now looking at rolling back that?
Yes. Qualified immunity came about because of a Supreme Court decision, like most things, where the Supreme Court basically argued that bureaucrats in general and people within the criminal justice system in particular have a great deal of discretion. Okay, going back to what we talked about several weeks ago. Because of that, you have to show that they exceeded their discretionary bounds and went over the line. They crossed the line, which is something that's extremely difficult. Like, it's extremely difficult to say that this officer was actively discriminating against me when that officer had some level of pretext or a reason to stop someone on the street or a discretionary reason to use force. This is why Attorney General Merrick Garland's comment or his statement that he released, I believe yesterday or maybe late Tuesday, saying that he and the Department of Justice were going to investigate the Minneapolis Police Department for a pattern and practice civil rights case, basically trying to examine whether there is a pattern or practice of discriminatory conduct that violates Minneapolis citizens' rights, their civil rights and liberties, to address the underlying conditions in Minneapolis. Like not just what happened with George Floyd, but Minneapolis Police Department's response to the protests, their past enforcement behaviors, their policies and procedures, like they're going all over the place, okay? So qualified immunity is something that we are going to have to pay a lot of attention to because ending it or rolling it back in some way means that officers are individually liable for their behavior, meaning they can be sued just like you can individually sue a mechanic or a doctor who makes a mistake. Okay. So this is one of the more popular needs of reform, particularly with things like use of force, because officers are probably going to be a lot more hesitant to use force if they realize, oh, if I use force incorrectly, I might lose my house. Okay. But there's also the counterpoint. Officers are going to be a lot less willing to use force or make arrests if the situation warrants it, because they might be more likely to be sued, which means officers may be more willing to use force against disadvantaged individuals because they have fewer resources, which is this second point right here under the bullet, that when a plaintiff or the person bringing the lawsuit can afford the cost of the suit, meaning they're hiring a lawyer and paying for their time, this may actually exacerbate the existing disparity within the criminal justice system, because people who are very rich, well off, or well connected may be more willing to abuse the legal system if qualified immunity is ended. Okay. Not saying it's a bad idea to reform it. I'm just saying that that's a possible consequence. Okay. When we're looking at the media itself and how we can use it to understand misconduct, again, we're approaching it from an understanding that we're not going to get a complete account for what's going on, because the media typically only reports on the most serious or sensational stories, meaning we're only seeing the absolute worst. We're not seeing the garden variety misconduct or issues. So if we're looking at the data from the textbook, they found a study that showed that almost 7,000 police officers had been arrested for crimes, okay? Out of approximately 1 million police officers, or no, not 1 million, like 500,000 police officers. So probably still in line with the national averages, maybe a little bit lower. But the most common types of crimes were fairly serious. Like, we would consider DUI to be a pretty serious crime right now, right? We don't want police officers who, in many instances, believe that they are superior drivers to the normal person. And in many instances they are. But we don't want someone with that kind of confidence in their abilities getting behind the wheel while intoxicated, because that's more likely to lead to an accident. But also, police officers are trained and implicitly encouraged to use violent means to accomplish what they want. Like, that's a part of their role in society. Okay, I'm not saying that officers are inherently violent. I'm saying that officers have access to a significant variety of weapons not typically available to the average individual. They are consistently trained on using those weapons. Their training encourages them to use those weapons in particular instances. And it's not a surprise that some officers would misuse that, either by doing things like getting into fights at the bar, all the way up to domestic abuse. Like, it's not uncommon for police officers to have restraining orders against them filed by their spouse or partner because of allegations of domestic abuse and intimate partner violence.
So other than their training, which is kind of a contextual contributor, what else do you think contributes to, these specific things?
I mean, contributing to officers being like violent or willing to break the law?
Both. Because
Okay.
they both kind of go towards that, authority complex that we often see in officers.
Okay, so Garrett's bringing up a couple of interesting points. Like, if we're looking at understanding why officers misbehave, like, approach it from a criminological standpoint. We have people who have access to violent means. They have the tools that they need to be violent. they're consistently and almost constantly exposed to instances where violence is encouraged, either from a within their department standpoint, like no one wants to be the person who is unwilling to use force, because what we've seen in the research is that officers expect their fellow officers to use force to protect others. But that can be taken a step further because officers are also exposed to criminal elements. Like they respond to those domestic abuse situations. They respond to gang shootings and gang activity, drug activity, fights, all that stuff. That has an effect on their behavior. Because social learning theory, differential association, and when we're looking at who the people who are willing to become police officers, our screening methods are not perfect. Okay, they're surveys, they're background checks, but people can either be borderline and not be automatically screened out because of a potential for problematic behavior later down the line. But also, even though things like personality are fairly consistent, they do change through adulthood. And everyone has a boiling point where they're going to snap and react in an active threat kind of manner. Like, not just in a domestic violence situation, but officers are also at a higher risk for suicide. They have access to firearms because, hey, all of them have guns. And there is definitely a savior complex. I could not save this person, or I'm not going to burden people with my issues. I'm just going to end it right now, okay? And we also have to look at, hey, police officers have a pretty, for lack of a better term, masculine subculture. Like it's not completely masculine. There are some helpful or more feminine aspects to it. But if we're looking at it from a gendered lens, masculinity typically encourages people to hide their issues, hide any kind of anger or substance abuse issues, or impulsive behavior, or any of that stuff. So when we're looking at why police officers commit acts of misconduct, I mean, criminology has some pretty decent examples. They have the tools, they have the training to be violent. They tend to ignore psychological or physiological problems, either through things like chemical imbalances, substance abuse issues, PTSD, anxiety, depression. They tend to self-medicate. And because of their access to, like, they know who and where the drug dealers are, they typically have access to drugs either through making drug buys themselves as part of a narcotics investigation, stealing it from evidence or whatever, so they have the means to self-medicate in a relatively risk-free way, in the sense that, like, they're not at risk of arrest in many instances. And when we look at them from a violent perpetrator standpoint, the victims of domestic assault, when the assaulter is a police officer, they tend to be afraid of the fact that the perpetrator knows what is going to trigger a red flag and actively avoids doing that.
You can almost fit them into like a routine activities framework.
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
not a lack of capable guardians, it's a lack of higher authority guardians.
Right. So in many instances, victims are afraid of reporting their abuser if their abuser is a police officer or affiliated with law enforcement. Like, murder-suicide is unfortunately not uncommon among law enforcement. Like it happens, I think I hear about it probably once a year, which is a lot. Okay. Everything making sense? So to recap a little bit, we have just 4 basic ways of examining misconduct, okay? We have self-report surveys, we have citizen complaints, we have lawsuits, and we have media reports, okay? That's basically it, okay? So there are a variety of things that we can do with this. And one of the most common ways that we can do this is through something called decertification, okay? I apologize for the angle grinder, I'm guessing. But decertification is when an officer's training is revoked, okay? Basically, they are disbarred or their license is pulled, okay? This is ridiculously uncommon, okay? Because most departments are unwilling to decertify someone for their behavior. Okay, when you look at the statistics I have on the lower end of this slide, 43 officers were decertified for a felony conviction. Okay, not a felony arrest. They were convicted of a crime. So of that 717 officers, let's do the math real quick. Oops. That's 308 officers who committed felonies and were convicted of them and were consequently decertified 10 years ago. Okay. For misdemeanors, convicted of committing a misdemeanor, probably something along the lines of drug possession or alcohol possession or alcohol-related offenses like a DUI or simple assault or something like that. It was 158 officers. Okay. For any other act of misconduct, we're looking at 150, maybe 151. Excuse me, 29%. So 208. Okay. That would be things like using excessive force, failing a drug test or something along those lines, or lying on a police report. So we're looking at over 200 officers who were fired and not just fired, but actively prohibited from law enforcement careers, okay? The reason why this is so uncommon is, first and foremost, it's a pretty long, drawn-out process, and like everything else in the criminal justice system, it's subject to evidentiary hearings and appeals. But also, a lot of departments don't want to go through the hard work of decertifying officers, for lack of a better term, because it is a long, drawn-out process. And like, how many of you could honestly say, like someone you've spent time with, like one of your classmates, you would vote and say, yes, absolutely, this person should be kicked out of the program? I see Garrett shaking his head. Is that
Yeah.
absolutely not, you're never going to do it?
No, I have a couple people in mind.
Okay, so Garrett has a couple of people in mind, so, okay. Juan, you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I do, for sure. This is something I've been thinking about, but yeah.
So since both Juan and Garrett have people in mind, you cannot name names. Tell me why you would do so.
because my interaction with them in classes and hearing what they've said is already extremely dangerous, understanding what they want to do.
Okay,
They're not even as a professional yet, they're already rationalizing seemingly not acceptable behavior.
okay, so Garrett's raising some ethical and personality issues that I'm guessing we're hoping that screening screening questions or personality assessments will remove them from applicant pools, or they develop in the program and adapt to, like, they change their thinking basically. Okay. Juan, what about you?
And it's not like a lot of people I have in mind. It's just like one or two, not really a lot. But they're very insular. They're insular. They're absolute. When presented with an idea, they feel like it's so like foreign. Like whenever I have debates with them, it's and I try not to be mean, but it's like when you're arguing with a fool, the only fool there is yourself. Like, it's
Okay,
hard to present facts when they don't want to even believe the
So-
facts.
It's
Both-
frustrating when people preach their opinion as gospel.
okay, so both of you are kind of presenting the personality aspects, like either they're exhibiting some kind of behavior that you find to be unethical or irrational, or there's some kind of personality conflict. The rest of you who have not chimed in, is that like, I'm not trying to level any judgment about what's been said, but is that grounds to fire someone? So Garrett's already shaking his head no. What would be grounds to kick someone out of this program? Like if we had that capability, if the 5 faculty could get together and say, we're booting them off the island like this is a 2000s reality show. Is Survivor still on the air?
Yeah.
Good God.
I think as the faculty of the department, if you can make that decision, it's a risk assessment of, are we confident this person can go out in the world and not do harm?
Okay. So that would mean that we as faculty, if we're doing this, we would be effectively conducting a risk assessment. Can we trust this individual to not actively harm either the community or our reputation? Because that's an important thing to consider. What would be the specific behaviors that would give rise to that within the department?
Discrediting research.
What do you mean by that?
I've had these conversations with Dr. Terry a lot. When you present the research on any topic, criminal justice, there are still individuals who, based on their own biases, is just going to throw the research out and say that it's not true, and then accuse faculty of just spewing opinions. So kind of that closed-minded thinking,
Okay. So
not willing to adapt.
not willing to adapt.
I concur, Garrett. That's a good point.
Okay. What about for plagiarism?
It should be a major one.
Say again, Gavin?
I said plagiarism should be a big thing to be able to get kicked out of at least the CJ program on.
Okay. Why? What about plagiarism is so bad? Me speaking rhetorically.
You're passing somebody else's work out.
You're effectively lying. You're lying about your work. Like, if there was one thing that we could kick people out of this department for, and I don't think we would ever do it very often because I have yet to encounter this actually, is cheating of any kind. Okay, reason being, it's extremely unethical. Now, that is faculty members at a university making a decision about someone not being in a major. Okay, we're not kicking them out of the university. So we're not depriving them of the ability to get a degree. So we're not doing anything of that nature. One of the main reasons why officers are not decertified at a higher rate is the fact that officers don't want to deprive someone of their livelihood. Okay. Like if someone is fired from a job, yeah, it sucks, but they're probably going to be able to get a new job pretty easily, something related. But if they are decertified, they are effectively blacklisted from the field. This is like if a medical doctor had their license taken away. That doctor is not ever going to be able to work again, or very rarely.
How come we're so quick to take away medical licenses?
It's getting more into the qualified immunity thing. So departments will often, this might be getting a little bit ahead. I forgot to review this, what I'm covering later in the slides, but in many instances, departments will offer their officers an option. Hey, we know you did this, so you can resign. If you choose not to resign, we'll begin termination procedures. Okay, effectively offering officers an easy way out. And how many of you have thought of the idea of saying, you can't fire me, I quit at a job that you hate? Okay, Garrett's raising his hand. So by virtue of deciding to quit a job versus being fired from a job, it's a lot easier for you to get that next job. Okay, because you resign and you can spend that resignation any way you want. I needed a change. There were personality conflicts. I didn't like the hours. I could use a raise. My partner or spouse or whatever got this job in this community. I wanted to be closer to them, like whatever, doesn't matter. So there was a really interesting article done in the state of Florida tracking what the authors call wandering officers, and basically found that these officers would make it about a year or two at police departments before they resigned pretty suddenly. And then they'd go join another department. And they effectively moved around the state going from department to department. And by looking into those records, we're able to basically say or see that a lot of these officers were resigning in lieu of being fired, either for things like falsifying reports or biased behavior on the job, or just standard, fireable offenses like missing work or lying on injury reports to get workman's comp, or showing up intoxicated, or committing minor criminal acts like speeding or parking violations or ridiculous things like that. Okay.
I know 3 strike laws haven't been great in the public, but what if officers were held to that standard of accountability? So you've been fired 3 times, it's automatic decertification.
That's an interesting thing. Like the idea of if an officer has been fired or has resigned in lieu of termination 3 times, they're automatically decertified. I think that would be a reasonable middle ground, but also we have to look at it like, how far do we extend these bounds? Because there is very little in the sense of a national database of certified officers. It is not like medical licensees, okay? The criteria for being a law enforcement officer is very different, state to state, department to department. So we would have to establish a national database of officers, because it's a lot easier to get a job moving from police department to police department than hospital to hospital. Because part about medical licensees or bar certifications for lawyers is the fact that you move to a new state, you have to pass the medical licensing exam and the bar exam for that state, okay? So we don't have any kind of certification exam for law enforcement officers, except for instances where departments may have supplemental training for their new officers, their new hires. So they go through a mini academy, it's typically like an onboarding process. You're told specific laws that are likely different, like dry county, things like that. So when we're looking at decertifying officers, it's a option, but it's also one that we don't employ very often. Okay. So we've talked about a lot of these instances. I apologize for kind of getting ahead of myself in the discussion, but these instances of misconduct and corruption that we've talked about tend to be due to several factors. So we have officer personality flaws, which means this is where the bad apple comes in, the idea that there's a bad apple in the organization. The counterpoint to this argument is that the bad apple spoils the bunch. That's the completion of the phrase. So by having a bad apple in an organization, they can delegitimize the organization itself, but they can also influence other officers and create a much bigger problem, okay? I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on these specific examples, but there were instances where like entire units of police officers were fired. Like I've talked about the LA County issue, I think about 15 years ago, where correction officers, like it was one of the departments where like you could be a correction officer, like you were trained initially as a corrections officer and then you were moved out to the street if you wanted to, but everyone was considered a police officer. There was a group of police officers on a unit who actively abused people who were arrested, like made it their job to physically abuse inmates. That may have been a bad apple kind of situation, but also it created a much bigger problem. Like, if memory serves, all those officers were fired, several of them were arrested and imprisoned, and I believe LA County was eventually dissolved. Like the LA County Sheriff's Department was disbanded, okay? And the specific issues that arise with relying on personality flaws is that, first and foremost, you have to identify them as quickly as possible, okay? This is why police officers are subject to a pretty intense personality screening test, and they're evaluated throughout the academy process and into their first couple of months, if not years on the job, to make sure that they are a good fit for the officer or for the organization, that they're not going to cause problems, okay? But we also have to examine the fact that it's the nature of the job to control behavior, okay? So there may be an implicit call to use excessive force to respond to situations in a brutal or extremely assertive manner that's unnecessary. So remember going back to the difference between excessive force and brutality. Excessive force is often a training issue. Some force was warranted, but too much force was used, okay? This crosses the line into brutality. If officers are willingly engaging in excessive force, that's no longer excessive force, that is brutality. So if an officer, or if a higher up, a superior, a captain, a chief, or the entire department encourages officers to get results, such as with the NYPD with stop and frisk, where, as we heard in the video that we listened to, or the video that we watched, there was audio of a child, a juvenile, being harassed by police officers, verbally accosted and threatened. The implied encouragement throughout the NYPD pretty consistently since the 90s has been to get results, to arrest criminals, to pull drugs and guns off the streets, without also encouraging those more community-friendly or legitimizing behaviors. Okay, and then we also have to consider the fact that there's a routine activities component. The environment in which officers work create opportunities for misconduct. Drug busts, in and of themselves, are a useful tool. They can be used to pull drugs and guns off streets. However, officers can also steal from evidence or steal things that after it's been logged or before it's been logged. But they can also do minor acts of deviance and misconduct. Like, believe, Paul, you brought up Lethal Weapon on Tuesday. In the third movie, Riggs, Mel Gibson's character, puts a brown paper bag over a parking meter to avoid getting a parking ticket. Like, yeah, that's not like excessive force or brutality. That's still misconduct. He's still parking illegally or not paying the meter. So it's still an issue with misconduct. Similarly, like the officer in Oklahoma City, he used his authority as a police officer to coerce sex workers, effectively raping them. Okay, and this gets into the characteristics itself of the job. Officers, either through just temptation alone or through a combination of their personality characteristics, their own pressures, like work pressures, stress, relationship issues, whatever, can be tempted to exploit their power and authority for personal gain. An officer who steals from evidence in order to pay for cancer treatments, noble goal, like you don't want to have someone die, you want to give someone life-saving treatment, but also theft from evidence, misconduct, a crime.
You see a lot of that, like fraud, and people who don't have a stake in the company but are stealing from the company.
So people who lack a stake in conformity, if we're going to use a proper criminological term, where someone doesn't have a vested interest, like, oh, this drug money is just going to be funneled to the DEA, or we're only going to use it for a community policing thing that I don't think is going to work. Therefore, I'm just going to steal 10 grand and use it to pay off my car. Okay. And this also combines with the fact that officers work in what's called a low visibility environment. There's very few witnesses around officers other than fellow officers and suspects. So if an officer wants to steal from a suspect that they're detaining for robbery, officers may not catch it, or they may fall into that code of silence where individual officers are discouraged by their subculture from reporting instances of misconduct. I'm assuming everyone has heard of the code of silence before, correct? Give me a thumbs up. What are the issues with the code of silence?
A lot of misconduct goes unreported.
Okay, misconduct goes unreported. It's the biggest thing. What does that lead to?
More misconduct being present.
Okay, more misconduct being present, because generally speaking, if someone's going to offend, they don't start at the top and work their way down. They do things like park illegally, take bribes or gratuities. They might steal a couple bucks from evidence. And if they're not reported, they may say, oh, well, that was easy. I didn't get caught. Do a little bit more.
I was gonna say it was like a Mexican standoff where it's like, oh, I saw you do this, now I'm gonna do this because you can't tell on me because I'm gonna tell on you if you do, you know?
Okay.
So
So-
it becomes like this web.
Yeah, just basically people using the information they have about other officers in order to protect their own misconduct. What does this do to people's opinion of law enforcement when this happens?
You start hearing the agency's name.
Garrett's been answering a lot of questions, but since a lot of you are online, y'all can chime in.
What was the question? I wasn't in my room.
What does the code of silence do to the reputation of law enforcement in the community?
Oh, it isolates them from regular society. It's why it seems like a clique.
Yeah. I mean, kind of hit the nail on the head. It isolates the police from the society. It reinforces the us versus them mindset. We have, like, police officers are an insular group that's charged with protecting society, but society doesn't understand what the police do. Like, I'm sorry, it's not an order of monks. It's a civil service job. Okay? When we're looking at the code of silence, it is effectively an arrogant assumption that because society has charged police with doing that particular job, fulfilling that role, society does not get a voice in how they are policed. Okay, making sense? So, I know we've been talking about all this stuff a lot, and realistically, every single slide that we have had in this lecture series is its own topic of research. Like the code of silence in particular, this is a pretty high profile niche within policing research. Same with this low visibility environment where researchers are focused on how do we examine low visibility decisions. In relation to this, we have to figure out, well, how do we control misconduct? Each of these things we're going to discuss in a lot more detail. So the first is controlling discretion in some way, shape, or form. This may be through standardizing procedures or giving officers explicit instructions like you cannot use force, you cannot make an arrest unless these things are met. If you do, it is then an issue, okay? It's either an issue of excessive force or it's grounds for expunging someone's record or something along those lines. But like we talked about several weeks ago, it is not possible to eliminate discretion and discretionary decisions from law enforcement, from really most jobs in general. Okay, we can control it though, a little bit, okay? A lot of this comes down to how we select officers. We need officers who can make moral and ethical decisions and correctly perceive situations and how they must be handled, okay? But that's very difficult. Like, a lot of you, I'm assuming, have taken things like personality assessments. And if you know anything about those assessments, you can kind of figure out, well, how do I want to manipulate this? And what shows up in a background check is often not directly relevant in weeding out marginal cases, okay? So someone who hasn't been caught driving under the influence or using drugs or stealing or fighting or whatever all that information would not show up in a background check. So we're left with not great information. Okay. We can also try to control discretion by changing or supplementing the culture within police departments to focus more on integrity and making good decisions rather than prioritizing the hard chargers or the people who make big busts or things like that. Drug busts or gang busts or whatever. Okay. But again, this is very difficult. Like, how do we change a culture? Like, how would we do this? Not a rhetorical question.
Change the culture of what?
Of police. Like, since none of you in here are police officers, let's take a step back and do something that's a little bit more close to home. How would we change the culture of Fort Hays?
Well, like if you have a mental health problem at Fort Hays, which, you know, most college students do struggle with mental health and literacy is low, then you have to address those educational gaps.
So
Which also applies to law enforcement.
Garrett's bringing up the fact that college students tend to have some mental health issues, either separation from home, relationship stress, financial stress, academic stress, all the stress, okay? We could change Fort Hays's culture about mental health. Like, we could target that, but how would we do it?
Normalizing.
Okay, we'd have to normalize behavior. Someone other than Garrett, though. How would we encourage students to reach out to mental health resources if they need it?
Well, you could do a maybe focused or direct advertisement for those different possibilities for receiving mental health help.
Okay. Letting students know that they have that option. Okay. First step, we have to make the service available. Does anyone know of anyone who absolutely refuses to go see a therapist or see a doctor? Like, not just for like, I'm having stress issues, but anything, going to see a doctor. I'm one of those people. I do not like going to see a doctor because, generally speaking, unless my shoulder falls out again, I don't think I need to see the doctor. Doctors are expensive. They take time away from work. They take time away from class. I would probably benefit from being more willing to go see a doctor, dealing with stress, managing my health, all that other fun stuff, okay? So we'd have to make a concerted effort to change the culture at Fort Hays. Destigmatizing going to see mental health practitioners. Giving students, faculty, and staff time off to go do that. Like,
If you do that, you're also going to expand the services because they're overburdened as is.
expand services, hire more therapists, get a more streamlined process if we need it, offer more services. Like, I don't believe the student health center might be able to prescribe certain medications, but we need an actual psychiatrist in many instances. Same with law enforcement. If we're going to create that culture of integrity, we would need to create mechanisms to monitor that culture. We would also need to change the messaging within the organization itself. Like, you must do a good and ethical job rather than you must get good busts to get advanced. Okay. Moving on a little bit, like if we were trying to crack down on the code of silence, like our first step would be something like creating rules and policies that obligate officers to report things. Okay. There was a really high profile incident in New York in, I believe, the late 80s and early 90s, where a narcotics detective reported misconduct, and he was actively harassed by his coworkers, like nailing dead rats to his door kind of thing. Okay. He was trying to do the right thing, and his coworkers retaliated against him. Like they tried to intimidate him, they tried to discredit him. So if we're going to create a way to break the code of silence, we would have to protect the officers who are going to try to report. We'd also have to demand mandatory reporting. If you see something, you must say something. You have no choice. If you see something that looks bad, you have to report it so it's investigated. We would also have to create and give some teeth to the citizen complaint process. That means we can't just have a complaint box that's like in full view of every single officer. So every single officer sees the person who's trying to complain. Anonymous complaint systems, or making it so that complaints are treated fairly. And this was something that your book points out a little bit, but some complaints imply that if someone is making a complaint that later turns out to be unsubstantiated, the complainer can be charged with perjury, which is a felony. If someone can't prove an allegation, that doesn't mean that allegation is false. It just means they don't have evidence. Okay. We would also need to actively conduct an investigation if that is merited. Like if someone is complaining that, hey, this officer brutalized my roommate, my partner, I witnessed brutality in the field, you would have to actively investigate it. This is the reason, this conducting an actual investigation of misconduct is the reason people are really thankful that the bystanders recorded George Floyd's death, his murder at the hands of Derek Chauvin, because people did not trust that there would be an actual investigation of misconduct that would be impartial and thorough. All right. And finally, getting back into that reinforcing a culture of integrity, officers need to be reminded of their ethical obligations. Okay. Like, if you ever work in some kind of public bureaucracy, higher education, correctional systems, courts, law enforcement, wherever, you are going to get some pretty frequent trainings that you might think are pointless. Like here at the university, we get a lot of sexual harassment and bias training, okay? Most of us probably think, oh, well, it's same old, like we know not to do these things, but it's always important to have that reminder, okay? This is not okay. And we need to be informed if the law is updated, okay? You can't just keep relying on the fact that, oh, I had this training in the 90s. Nothing has changed since the 90s. Everything has changed since the 90s, okay? Same with police officers. Constantly undergoing ethical training. Like 5 years ago, officers may not have been trained in issues related to LGBTQIA+ issues. Use of pronouns, dead naming would not have been anything that most officers were concerned about. Now it's something that, hey, you need to be mindful of this. This is important. This relates to someone's identity and sense of self. It's an important, valued concept. We must treat it ethically, okay? You need the training to do that. Related to this, we also, when we find issues of misconduct, we need to decertify them. We need to remove them from the field, okay? The only way that officers can stop, the only way that departments can stop hiring bad officers is if they're decertified or if the reasons behind their termination are known. Like the officer who shot Tamir Rice within a second of exiting his vehicle when he had a toy was hired almost a year later by a police department. And only the public outcry of the fact that, hey, this dude killed a child by accident, you really want him, led to that department saying, okay, we're sending the offer, thanks for pointing it out. Like, there may have been a public relations thing in there, I don't know, but if he was decertified as an officer, that wouldn't have been an issue in the first place. We'd also have to change when and why officers are decertified, because if people are fired for misconduct, but they're not decertified, that is reason for that officer to just go try their luck elsewhere. And from a federal level, we would need some level of standardization for officer certification, when officers can be decertified, and reporting those decertifications and firing to public. Like if someone resigns in lieu of being terminated, you kind of need to let people know that, hey, we were going to fire him, but they left anyway. Okay. Lastly, and most difficult, would be some level of early intervention system. Okay. Because the reason why this would be so important is because it would allow us to address issues before they reach the threshold of misconduct. Okay. Great goal. I think everyone would really love it if it existed, but the reason why it's so difficult is we would need to identify what we're looking at as performance indicators and what we would be able to consider to be a performance indicator. Like one thing that we would probably want to include in a model, if we're just going to do a standardized predictive statistical model about when or why someone would be more likely to commit misconduct, would be something like their gender. Males tend to be more aggressive. Males tend to not report problems, health problems, psychological problems, PTSD symptoms, substance abuse issues. They also tend to self-medicate. But for those of you who may have remembered from administration of justice or from any kind of job that you've had, sex and gender are protected concepts. You cannot be evaluated differently based on your sex or gender. So including that in a predictive model raises some red flags, like we're implying that males are more likely to be issues. So leads to kind of a legalistic challenge of the statistical model. Okay. We'd also want to understand the threshold at which those indications are deemed problematic. Okay. I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard of a, or how many of you have heard of alpha or is less than 0.05? Maybe from a stats class or research methods, or you've read it in an article, or statistically significant. Okay. In the social sciences, statistically significant usually means that there is roughly a 5% chance that if all other things were being equal, we would just find a random result. Okay. How many of you would want to be given additional training on a 5% likelihood that you don't actually need it. Like, you're just normal, you filled out the survey correctly, like you did everything by the book, but because of a stats model, you were directed to go to anger management training. Some of you might not have problems with it because, hey, it's a new skill. I'm learning how to manage my emotions a little bit better. But there's also you were given anger management training, you must have an anger management issue. Okay, so this is where we're getting into the limitations here. Criteria for intervention may be BS. It may also be impossible to include, like when we're talking about gender. And if we if we set specific thresholds for intervention, like, oh, you had above this level of score on this particular assessment, that means departments are probably going to either intervene too much or intervene too little. So they're either going to waste their resources on people who don't need it, or they're not going to give enough people those additional trainings. And we also have to keep in mind how departments would use something like an early intervention system. If this is a criteria for promotion, people are going to start either gaming the system or challenging it in court. Okay. If it's a threshold for internal affairs investigations or reviews of officer behavior, systems are going to get overburdened real quick. Okay. So bottom line with this, I apologize for us going a little bit over on time, but bottom line with this, controlling misconduct is going to be the next big area of research focus within criminal justice and policing in particular. This is where things like de-escalation training, implicit bias training, ethics training, all come into play, okay? So when you think about how do we actually go about controlling misconduct, understand that first and foremost, it's a very high profile field. It is constantly developing and changing. And also, we're never going to be perfect. It's like criminology itself. We're never going to have that perfect explanation for criminal behavior. So consequently, we're never going to have a perfect control of misconduct. All right. Does anyone have any questions?